Welcome back, everyone. I'm glad you decided to tune in to Biblical Musings and continue our study on Joshua. If you have not been caught up, I'd encourage you to go back and watch the backlog, beginning with the introduction. I believe it would be helpful to provide a context for what you're going, and I appreciate all of you who are watching and making this possible. We're in Joshua chapter 9 today, or whenever it is that you're watching this, and we're going to look at the guile or deceit of the Gibeonites and how Israel responds to that. So before we jump in, we all, as a way of an introduction, we all deal with deceit, lies, guile that invades itself into our lives all the time. If you've ever turned on a TV, if you've ever looked on the internet, if you've ever read a book, if you've ever listened to someone speak, there's a very high likelihood you've been exposed to things that simply were not true. Now, we can debate about which one was not true and which one was false and all of that. It's not really why we're here. The point is, we're surrounded, and always have been and probably always will be, surrounded on all sides by many different narratives. Many different things claiming to be this or claiming to be that. But how do we discern what is true? How do we discern what we act on? How do we discern and make a decision when all around us is deceitful? Well, we're going to read today and see how the Israelites responded when they were surrounded by deceit or exposed to it in this form. And hopefully we can draw some lessons from them and not repeat the mistakes, and hopefully repeat the good things that Israel does in the past and the examples we learn from them. So I'd encourage you to open your Bibles to Joshua chapter 9, beginning in verse 1, and let's do some reading together. Beginning in Joshua 9, like I said, in verse 1. It says, "Now it came about when all the kings who were beyond the Jordan, in the hill country and in the lowland, and on all the coast of the great sea toward Lebanon, the Hittite, the Amorite, the Canaanite, and the Perizzite, the Hivite, and the Jebusite heard of it, that they gathered themselves together with one accord to fight with Joshua and with Israel." Now, if you didn't tune in last week, what they heard about was the Battle of Ai. They heard how Israel suffered defeat, yes, but that they came back, and with God at their head, and with God leading the battle plan, that they defeated the city of Ai and its king and its army and totally destroyed them. And so they did to Ai and its king just like they did to Jericho a few days before, or a week or so, however exactly it played out. And so the people around are becoming increasingly aware of Israel's presence in the land of Palestine, in the land of Canaan. We see here two different groups, well, probably more than two, but they're kind of split into two groups. Two different groups of people and how they each respond when they hear about what Joshua has done with the Lord's help. Or more like what the Lord has done with Joshua obeying him. But that's kind of what we talked about in the last couple of weeks. And so we see that this first group, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Jebusites, the Canaanites, all of these folks, they decide to gather together, to band themselves together into a big group to fight Joshua when they hear that he's had some success. When they hear about it, they decide to gather together with one accord, all together to fight in a big battle. But we see in verse 3, through following, 3 through verse 6, says, "When the inhabitants of Gibeon heard what Joshua had done to Jericho and to Ai, they also acted craftily, and set out as envoys, and took worn-out sacks on their donkeys, and wineskins worn out and torn and mended, and worn out and patched sandals on their feet, and worn out clothes on themselves, and all the bread of their provision was dry, and had become crumbled. And they went to Joshua, to the camp at Gilgal, and said to him and to the men of Israel, We have come from a far country. Now therefore, make a covenant with us." So we see these two groups split among the inhabitants of Canaan, the idolatrous men and women who live in the land, who have judgment coming upon them by God and the people of Israel, we see two groups beginning to form. One group says we need to band together, and they do so, and fight Joshua and his people and destroy them. The other group sees what Joshua has done to Jericho and Ai, and they say, in essence, we don't want to fight that. Let's fool them, let's deceive them, and get them to make a covenant with us, to not destroy us, to be our allies, whatever they can get, I think, at this point. And so they go about this really elaborate deception. They get worn out garments and food and clothes and shoes and tired old donkeys and sacks with holes in them and put their food and stuff and pretend like they've come from a really long way off. And then they come to Israel like they're all beat up and tired and worn out, like they've done a months-long journey across the wilderness, and say, hey, we just want to be friends with you people. We live a long way off. Why don't we make a covenant? Now, Israel has a deceitful or a not true thing presented to them. The people who are saying this are acting on fear, to be sure. They're afraid of the Lord. They're afraid of Joshua. The way what Israel is receiving is a lie. This is not true. These people are not far away. They are not hungry. They are not ragged and torn. They live very close by, and they have many large, prosperous cities very close by. So let's see how Israel responds to the deception. We ended by saying, as the Gibeonites said, we have come from a far country. Now, therefore, make a covenant with us. Verse 7. The men of Israel said to the Hivites, that's who these people are, perhaps you are living within our land. How then shall we make a covenant with you? But they said to Joshua, we are your servants. Then Joshua said to them, who are you, and where do you come from? And they said to him, your servants have come from a very far country, because of the fame of the Lord your God. For we have heard the report of him, and all that he did in Egypt, and all that he did to the two kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon king of Heshbon, and Og king of Bashan, who was at Ashtaroth. So our elders and all the inhabitants of our country spoke to us, saying, take provisions in your hand for the journey, and go to meet them, and say to them, we are your servants. Now then, make a covenant with us. Notice what they did there. They were intelligent, these Hivites, these Gibeonites, these people from these few cities. Joshua asked them, who are you, and where did you come from? They answer with a deception, the second part, and totally avoid the first part of that question. They do not answer who they are, but they falsely say where they came from. They say, we come from a far, far country, and we just came because we heard your God was awesome. We heard what he did to Egypt. We heard what he did to Sihon and Og over there beyond the Jordan. And notice even in that, they've really thought this deception through, because those events, the events in Egypt happened 40 years ago, and the events with Sihon and Og were months back, months and months ago. So it's given time for them to have journeyed from a very long country. They don't mention Jericho, they don't mention Ai, they don't mention the Jordan River crossing, which they most certainly heard about. They don't mention recent events to give credence to the fact that they've been traveling from a very far place. And they say, we want a covenant. Make a covenant with us. Verse 12 says, this our bread was warm when we took it for our provisions out of our houses on the day that we left to come to you. But now, behold, it is dry and has become crumbled. These wineskins which we filled were new. Behold, they are torn, and these our clothes and our sandals are worn out because of the very long journey. So the men of Israel took some of their provisions and did not ask for the counsel of the Lord. Joshua made peace with them and made a covenant with them to let them live, and the leaders of the congregation swore an oath to them. So Israel is totally and completely fooled. Joshua and the leaders and the people, everybody, they see the provisions and say, well, this bread is definitely old and crumbled. It must be old bread, therefore the people must have traveled a very long way. And now it was a very simple ruse. They just took old bread and took it with them. But Israel is fooled. They swear an oath to make peace with them, to make a treaty with them, to not destroy them, to be friendly to them, etc. Joshua and the leaders all make an oath and a covenant. The leaders specifically making an oath, and Joshua making a covenant to let them live. The key verse there, I think, though, is verse 14. Maybe of this whole chapter. Maybe of this whole part of the Bible. They did not ask the counsel of the Lord. They didn't ask God what He wanted them to do about it. Now, we just saw how Israel acted with Ai, and they didn't ask God, and they went up there, and they got defeated because they had sin in the camp. You think they would have learned what just transpired, that they should always ask God, God, is this what you want us to do? God, what do you think about this? God, what's your will for us in this scenario? What have you said in the past? What have you written down for us to learn? What do you want us to do? They have access to prayer. They have access to the priest. They have access even to the Urim and Thummim, by which they can ask God's will. And he says he would let them know. They do not ask. They do not ask. And so they get in a heap of trouble. Well, let's keep reading and see what they do about it. So beginning in verse 16, it says, "It came about at the end of 3 days, after they had made a covenant with them, that they heard that they were neighbors, and that they were living within the land, within their land. Then the sons of Israel set out and came to their cities on the 3rd day. Now their cities were Gibeon and Chephirah and Beeroth and Kiriath Jearim. The sons of Israel did not strike them, because of the leaders of the congregation had sworn to them by the Lord, the God of Israel, and the whole congregation grumbled against the leaders. But all the leaders said to the whole congregation, We have sworn to them by the Lord, the God of Israel, and now we cannot touch them. Thus we will do to them, even let them live, so that wrath will not be upon us, for the oath which we have sworn to them. The leaders said to them, Let them live, and so they became hewers of wood and drawers of water for the whole congregation, just as the leaders had spoken to them. Then Joshua called for them and spoke to them, saying, Why have you deceived us, saying, We are very far from you, when you are living within our land? Now therefore you are cursed, and you shall never cease being slaves, both hewers of wood and drawers of water for the house of my God. So they answered Joshua and said, Because it was certainly told your servants that the Lord your God had commanded his servant Moses to give you all the land, and to destroy all the inhabitants of the land before you. Therefore we feared greatly for our lives because of you, and have done this thing. Now behold, we are in your hands. Do as it seems good and right in your sight to do to us. Thus he did to them, and delivered them from the hands of the sons of Israel, and they did not kill them. But Joshua made them that day hewers of wood and drawers of water for the congregation and for the altar of the Lord to this day, in the place which he would choose. So we see here kind of the conclusion of this part of the Gideon matter. We'll see in the next chapter how Gibeon continues to... there's still some things that happen with Gibeon, in other words. We'll deal with that next time. But the leaders and Joshua have made a mistake. They have not asked God what he would do. And we never get the response because they never asked. We don't know what God's exact response would have been to the Gibeonites coming and pretending to be neighbors out of fear that they would be destroyed. We don't know if God would have spared them. We don't know if God would have told Israel, no, my original orders stand. These people deserve everything that's coming to them. We don't know. We don't know. All we have is the effects of what Israel does. They listen to the deception. They swear oaths. But I believe Joshua and Israel do the best with the mess they've made. Because if they break their oath that they've sworn by the Lord God of heaven, then they'll be liars and deceivers too, just like the Gibeonites were. However, by keeping the oath they've sworn, yes, under false pretenses, yes, they were lying, all of that, yes, God has commanded them to take all the land. Yes, God has commanded them to wipe out all the inhabitants of the land. But they have also, just now, even though they were deceived, sworn by the God of heaven that they would not attack these Gibeonites, who are now their next door neighbors. And so they keep their oath because they figure the way I figure, that two wrongs don't make a right. If they too lie and deceive and break their oaths, then they'll be like the Gibeonites and they'll be like the people who inhabit the land. God has no pleasure in oath breakers and liars, as we can see from other stories. And so the Gibeonites live in Israel to this day. It says, so when Joshua was written, the book, the history of what had happened, the Gibeonites were still alive and well. And so we also see the Gibeonites know quite a bit about God. They know quite a bit about Moses. They know about what God has commanded them to do, to take the land. And so they choose to deceive but survive. However, it's interesting where the Gibeonites end up later. We're going to read another story. It's not in Joshua, but I think it's applicable. It's in 2 Samuel 21. 2 Samuel chapter 21, we see the Gibeonites come up again. And we're kind of landing in a different context and in a different time period, hundreds of years later. But it's tied to the story we just read. And so I think it'll be interesting for us. So let's read the first 7 verses of 2 Samuel chapter 21. Now it says, there was a famine in the days of David for 3 years, year after year. And David sought the presence of the Lord. And the Lord said, it is for Saul and his bloody house, because he put the Gibeonites to death. So the king called the Gibeonites and spoke to them. Now the Gibeonites were not of the sons of Israel, but of the remnant of the Amorites, and the sons of Israel made a covenant with them. But Saul had sought to kill them in his zeal for the sons of Israel and Judah. Thus David said to the Gibeonites, what should I do for you, and how can I make atonement that you may bless the inheritance of the Lord? Then the Gibeonites said to him, we have no concern of silver or gold with Saul or his house, nor is it for us to put any man to death in Israel. And he said, I will do for you whatever you say. So they said to the king, the man who consumed us and planned to exterminate us from remaining within any border of Israel, let 7 men from his sons be given to us, and we will hang them before the Lord in Gibeah of Saul, the chosen of the Lord. And the king said, I will give them. An interesting story by all accounts, and we're not here to delve into everything that happens in 2 Samuel 21. But let's look at what ties to Joshua chapter 9. The Gibeonites, hundreds of years later, are still living in Israel. They still know about God. And from what we can glean, they are probably worshipers of God now. They've lived for hundreds of years beside Israel, worshiping, working. One of their tasks that Joshua set them to was to help provide wood and water for the worship, for the tabernacle. So they've been right next to the worship center of the God of heaven for hundreds of years potentially now. They know about God now. They apparently have been worshiping him. They're not perfectly assimilated, but they would consider themselves part of Israel in many ways, even though they're not Israelite. But Saul, the bloody King Saul, whom God did choose, but who rebelled and disobeyed just almost every chance he got, and whom God cast off. Saul, we learn, not because of his zeal for God, but because of his zeal for Israel and Judah, decided to exterminate the Gibeonites, even though they'd been living peacefully with them for hundreds of years at this point. And even though the Gibeonites served the tabernacle, even though they had sworn oaths not to attack the Gibeonites, Saul didn't care about any of that. He just didn't like them. He just was zealous for his own people, something along those lines, and decided to destroy them. And so David is king. And Israel, the whole nation, is being punished by a 3-year famine because Saul broke his oath. Saul broke the oath of peace that Joshua and the elders had made with the Gibeonites. And God was not okay with that. So what do we learn? There's 2 things I think we learn from Joshua chapter 9 and we see exemplified in 2 Samuel 21. God does not like liars. God does not like oath breaking. God is for truth and honesty and uprightness. He is. And there's no exceptions to that I'm aware of. There's never a right time to deceive and to lie and to break oaths. It's always the right time to speak the truth. It's always, even if it leads to your own pain and suffering or even death, it's always right in God's eyes to tell it like it is, to tell the truth. We learn something else too, though. When men and women don't seek God's counsel, they get into a mess. Now, Joshua and the leaders of Israel did not ask God's counsel about the Gibeonites. Would God have cleared up the situation? Absolutely. God is all-knowing. They didn't ask, so they got into a mess. However, in my view, from what I can read and what I can determine, they did act correctly with the mess they created. They kept their oaths. They tried to seek the Lord's will as far as possible after they made a mistake, and they moved forward, which is all we can do. Then we get to 2 Samuel 21. I believe the same two lessons are very clear. Here we have a problem has arisen. What does David do? He seeks the Lord. He seeks the Lord's counsel. He says, God, what's happening? What's going on? What do you want me to do about it? And God tells him, this is what's happening, and here's why. And if you read the conclusion of the matter in 2 Samuel 21, I know we're not studying that, you'll see that God says, all right, all this has been cleared up, now I'll move the famine away. You learned the lesson, justice was paid, all of that. The same two things. Seeking God's counsel, seeking His will, what does God think about this? Even in the little things. And truth. Truth and living by what we say are two very important lessons from Joshua chapter 9 and 2 Samuel chapter 21. Well, I hope you tune in next week to see more about the Gibeonites and the struggle of Joshua and the people of Israel to conquer the land of Canaan. There's many lessons that are applicable for us to learn, and I pray you're enjoying our study. Until next time, this has been Biblical Musings, and I thank you for joining us.